Well, tonight we start this new exciting series, and boy, I got to tell you, I'm super pumped about this message series titled Not So Average Joe. In case you don't know what we're talking about or who we're talking about Joseph in the Old Testament, right? I'm just going to call him Joe for this series. So whenever I say Joe, I'm talking about Joseph from the Old Testament. Now, before we start tonight's message is titled Family Issues, by the way. Well, I tell you, if you have some issues with your siblings or parents, or if you got some sort of drama in your family, you're going to love tonight's message because you will connect with this family like crazy. It's going to be good. But to help you give you a handle on Joe's life before we even start, you need to understand that Joe's life happens in three different stages. The first stage in Joe's life happens from birth to age 17. And during this period, Joe's family is constantly in motion. They're moving from one location to another, and there's all kinds of messy family drama. We'll look at one of them tonight. The second stage is age 17 to 30, and this is perhaps one of the more difficult seasons in Joseph's life. I mean, he goes from one bad trial to an even more terrible trial. It is just ugly. And then the third stage of Joe's life is age 30 to age 110. Boy, he lived a long time. And this we would describe as the rewarding stage of his life. This is when God rewards Joe for every struggle that he goes through, and God blesses him so amazingly that he ends up being a blessing not only to his family, but to multiple nations. And so you're going to want to stick with us through the series as much as you can, because if you start just at stage one and you leave it at that, you might leave hopeless and kill yourself. But if you stick with us through it, you'll find that there is great hope and there's great comfort. I apologize for that. I'm a little bit high this evening. I think I had coffee or something. Anyway, tonight we're going to start at stage one. And here's what I want to do tonight. Instead of looking at starting the series off with Joe's life, I think it's important to understand his entire story by looking at Joe's family. I think if you understand Joe's family, you'll really get the most out of this message. And here's why it's important to start this series about Joseph with an understanding of his family. It's important because the kinds of relationship that you had with your family of origin growing up will have an incredible influence on who you are today and who you're becoming. Let me say that again. The family of origin that you come from and the kinds of relationship dynamic you experience in your family will play a huge role in who you are and who you're becoming. In fact, I would even go as far as to say the way that you relate with your mom and dad, or the way you related with your mom and dad growing up, will play out in the way you relate to adults today. Your relationship with your parents and even your siblings to some extent has a huge role on the kind of adult you become and how you interact with other adults. And we'll see how that plays out in tonight's message with Joe. Now, depending on the relationship dynamic you have with your family, it could turn out really good for you. Or if you grew up in some dysfunctional families, it could turn out really bad if you don't learn to address those issues. In Joe's life, it's sort of a mixed bag because the relationship that Joe had with his family growing up should have resulted in him being a very dysfunctional adult when we look at his backstory. I mean, this is the kind of kid that would be prime for just having a messed up, drug-infused, alcohol-addicted life in light of some of the things he went through. But through this story, we're actually going to find out that God is a God who redeems. God is a God who restores. God is a God, here it is. God is a God who can heal and make whole a wounded heart. God can make whole again some pain that you've dealt with that is perhaps causing you to act a certain way as an adult. And at the end of the message, I'll give you 3 points that will really help you see how this can play out in your life. Huge. It's huge. Anyway, with that, in spite of our sometimes dysfunctional families, let's open our Bibles to Genesis chapter 37. If you have a Bible with you, if you don't, I'll read for you. Genesis chapter 37. Joe's life spans 12 chapters in the book of Genesis, really from chapter 37 to I think chapter 50 or 51. It's actually an extended time, and we'll make our way systematically through each one of his life stories. But man, I'm almost certain you'll find yourself in one of these stories. Once again, if you come from a family where there's been a little bit of drama, this is your dude. This is the guy you want to learn from. So let's meet Joe. Joseph, chapter 37. Look at the first two verses. It says, Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. And this is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks of his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought their father a bad report about the brothers. All right, let's just stop there. Let's stop here for a number of reasons, because we're introduced to this character named Jacob, and you should know him. So Jacob, whose name later on is changed to Israel, Jacob is Joseph's father. At this point in the story, Jacob, the father, is much older in life. He has had 4 wives, 12 sons, and 1 daughter. That's important for you to remember. Jacob has 4 wives, 12 sons, 1 daughter. Now, when Jacob was a young man, he was attracted to this incredibly beautiful girl. Scripture specifically calls her incredibly beautiful. Jacob was attracted to this incredibly beautiful girl named Rachel. And so Jacob approaches Rachel's father and says, hey, listen, I love your daughter. I want to marry her. And in exchange for her hand in marriage, I'm going to work for you for 7 years. All right, fellas, aren't you glad we live today? Right? 7 years, right? So on the night of their honeymoon, when Rachel and Jacob are supposed to culminate their wedding, Rachel's father tricks Jacob into marrying Rachel's older sister, Leah. Whoa, what's going on, right? It's a messy family, right? That's what happens. Anyway, Jacob obviously finds this out. He's disappointed. He's like, wait a minute, I didn't work 7 years for Leah. I worked 7 years for you to marry Rachel. Father's like, well, it is what it is. You got to marry Leah, right? So Jacob, still madly in love with Rachel, decides, you know what, fine. I'm going to work for you another 7 years so I can have Rachel's hand in marriage. So after 14 years of working for their father, Jacob now has 2 wives. One he really loves, Rachel, and one he kind of sort of has to like, Leah. That's the situation dude finds himself in, right? Over the next few years, after both women are married to Jacob, they begin what I can only describe as a childbirthing WrestleMania, right? Both women are trying to win Jacob's affection. So they just start popping out babies, because back then, if you could give your husband babies, it meant you were really his and you provided him with, basically cheap labor. And so Leah gives birth to 6 children. Man, that's huge, right? Rachel, the girl who he actually does love, apparently cannot have any children. So she starts crying out to God. She starts praying to God. God blesses Rachel, and she has 1 son, and his name is Joseph. Joe, our main character. Now, in between all that childbirthing WrestleMania, there's more drama going on. You see, the girls try to get an edge on one another. These sisters are kind of going at each other. And so they decide to bring their servant maids throw them into competition. And so both of them offer their servant, which was common back then. All right, this was a common culture. Both of them offer their servant maids to Jacob to say, hey, listen, she's going to be with you on my behalf, sleep with her on my behalf, and they'll bear children for me on my behalf. And so Rachel offers her servant to Jacob, and Leah offers her female servant to Jacob. When all is said and done, Jacob now has 4 wives, 11 boys, and 1 girl. A little dysfunctional, you think? Moving on. All of this, by the way, is taking place during a period when the entire family, all of them are traveling. I mean, they are moving from one location to another. God had made a promise to their grandfather Abraham that he would take him and his descendants to a specific piece of land in Canaan, which ultimately becomes Israel. And so they're moving constantly to get to that final destination. Along the way, they make many stops. One of their stops as a family is a location called Shechem. Remember that name. Location is called Shechem. Unfortunately, while the family is temporarily hanging out at Shechem, Jacob's only daughter, a girl named Dinah, is raped by one of the local princes. I mean, it's a messy, messy affair. Jacob, the father, seems a little disconnected. He seemed a little passive. He didn't really respond as a father should respond when such a thing is done to your daughter. He appears to be a little bit of a passive father. However, Dinah's brothers are angry. These dudes are furious. And so the account in Genesis chapter 34 says her brothers essentially go into town where their sister was raped and make a deal with the guys that essentially incapacitates them for a few days. While the men of that city in Shechem are incapacitated, the brothers go in later that night and they kill every single man in town as a revenge for raping their sister. You would think the drama stops there, right? It doesn't. Because as they move from there, they continue on their journey. Rachel, that's Joseph's mom, the girl who Jacob really likes, dies along the way during childbirth. She gives birth to another son, Benjamin. But while she does that, she dies. So now Jacob is down to 3 wives, 12 sons, and 1 daughter. I mean, you're stepping back thinking, finally, right? No, there's one more event, right? Shortly after Rachel dies, Jacob's oldest son, a young man named Reuben, decides that he's going to go sleep with one of his father's servant wives. And so there's some weird incest in the family. He sleeps with her. Jacob doesn't do anything about it, at least not right there and then. He kind of remains a little passive. He hears about it, remains passive. Perhaps he's still grieving over Rachel, the one woman he actually does love. This is the family. This is the family into which Joseph is born. Can you imagine the level of dysfunction that this? I mean, how many of you guys got some family problems? Compared to this guy, you're doing okay. They got some serious dysfunctional issues in this family. And like many families today, this biblical families have skeletons in its closets. I think all our families do. We all have things in our past that our parents have done that has happened within the family, right? We have skeletons in our closet. I mean, consider this family. There's murder, there's rape, there's incest, there's going to be hatred, there's jealousy, there's sibling rivalry, there's competition, there's passivity, there's toxicity, there's insecurity. I mean, name it, this family has it. Which probably explains why Joseph actually ends up becoming Jacob's favorite son. It says that when we get in chapter 37, right? Joseph becomes Jacob's favorite son, and perhaps this, I was thinking about this, and I think it's possible Joseph becomes his favorite son because I think Jacob just wants to get away from the rest of his family, man. There's just too much drama. Or every time he looks at Joseph, it reminds him of Rachel, the one woman he actually did really like, the one woman he really wanted to marry. Whatever the case is, when we get to the beginning of chapter 37, the first 2 verses we just read, Jacob is starting to play favorites with his sons. Joseph has become daddy's little dude, which explains why verse 2 says he brought his father a bad report about his brothers. It is daddy's little dude. He's ratting on his brothers because dad's going to hug him and carry him and make a big deal about him, right? So when we start in this book, in the story of Joseph, with all that history you know now that this family is already in a there are some toxic relationships in this family. Jacob himself doesn't help matters much by what he does next. Look at verse 3. Here's what he does, and Jacob does. It says, now Israel, who's also called Jacob. Now Israel, that's Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age. Okay, parents play favorites from time to time. That's fine. But look what he does next. And then Jacob made an ornate robe for Joseph. When his brothers saw that their father loved Joseph more than any of them, they hated Joseph and could not speak a kind word to him. So think about all the dysfunction going on in this family, all the hating and all think about how unhealthy this family already is. Jacob, in his wisdom, decides to add fuel to the fire by making public that Joe, the one guy that they probably don't like, is the one guy that is his favorite. And he doesn't just show it, he doesn't just say it, but he shows it by getting Jacob this ornate robe. Let me talk about this robe for a second, because this robe that Jacob gives to Joseph is no ordinary robe. Really, the word there is coat of many colors. If you like country music, how many of you guys know Dolly Parton wrote a song called, wow, you got some country folks, and that's awesome. I thought I was the only black guy who likes country. Awesome. Dolly Parton writes a song called Coat of Many Colors. Man, this coat was amazing. This coat was colorful. It was expensive. It was a long sleeve, ankle length, and get this coat was reserved for royalty. Not just anyone wore this coat. In fact, if your father gave you this coat, it was understood that he intended you to be the future leader of the family, a position which, by the way, is supposed to go to the oldest son. Are you getting how bad this is for Joseph right now? 11 brothers. Dad just said, you're my favorite. By the way, everyone else doesn't like you. I think it would have been much easier if Jacob just painted a target on Joseph's back and just left him. Because he just assisted in moving his other sons from simply not liking Joseph to now really hating him. But Joe's growing problems don't end there. You see, not only does Jacob show Joseph favor, but God himself has favored Joseph over the rest of the brothers. And God shows it to Joseph by revealing it to him in a dream. God shows him this amazing dream that I'm going to read of in a second. And Joseph decides to do, I don't know if it's arrogance or if it's just teenage immaturity, because he's 17 years old at this point, but he does the dumbest thing you can do when God gives you a promise. Here's what he does. Let me read it to you. Verse 8, it says, Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, really? Right? Let me read the dream to you. He told it to his brothers. They hated him all the more. He said to them, listen to the dream I had, y'all. Here's what he says. He says, we were together in the fields. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose up, stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. His brothers said to him, so what do you think? You intend to reign over us, to rule over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then Joseph had another dream, and in his brilliant plan, decides to tell his brothers again. He said, listen, I had another dream. And this time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars, that's his brothers, were bowing down to me. And foolishly, he told not only his brothers, but he told his father. And his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Not very smart kid, is he? Half the people at home, maybe all of them, don't like you. And so you go tell them that, hey, listen, God showed me in a vision that I'm going to be more awesome than you guys could ever dream to be. Isn't that great? Now, here's why things are going to go from bad to worse. Here's why that dream is really, I think, what triggers this mess that's about to happen. You see, in Jacob's family, dreams were a common occurrence. You see, in Jacob's life, God had communicated some serious, vivid things to Jacob through dreams. And so the family understood that when people had dreams, it was from God. They understood the power of dreams, and they understood that God communicated to this particular family through dreams. And so the family would have understood that Joe's dream was no joke. These guys understood that God was really going to make this young brat the greatest among us. So that's a scary place for Joe to be. I mean, Joe has gone from an annoying little brother that they hate to a serious threat to their livelihood. The brothers are thinking, wait, God's going to make this guy greater. He's going to take our portion, our blessing. He's just become a serious threat. And the fact that the growing animosity in this family has not been addressed, and because the father has remained somewhat passive, those strong emotions that the brothers are feeling is going to move from an emotion to deadly action. And boy, that's the cycle that sin passes through. It starts with just bad feelings, and I don't like this person, I don't like talking with them, and it moves to hate, right? And hate is kind of more, it's a little passive, we just don't like them, we don't want to interact with them, but then it moves to jealousy, right? And that hate transitions to jealousy, and jealousy begins to work out in action, right? Because when we get jealous of people, we start acting out on it, and it just gets worse and worse and worse, and it happens in many families, that happens in many workplaces, but it's going to get really real for Joseph right now. On one afternoon, his father sends Joseph to go look his brothers. His brothers are out in the field. They're working. Dad calls Joseph. He says, listen, your brothers are out of town. Go look where they are. Go see how they're doing. 70 miles later, Joseph finds them, but when he does, all their animosity towards him reach a boiling point. That's where we are in verse 18. Joseph is looking for his brothers, and they are ready for him. Verse 18 says this, if you're following. Genesis 37, verse 18, it says, but they, that's the brothers, saw Joseph in the distance, and before he reached them, here's where just not liking him has gone to hate, and it's gone to jealousy. Before reaching them, they plotted to kill him. Has it gone worse really quickly? Yep. Verse 19, they said to themselves, here comes that dreamer. Come now, let's kill him. This is your brother, by the way. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Let's throw him into this deep well. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. Verse 21, when Reuben, the oldest son, heard this, he tried to rescue Joseph from their hands. Reuben says to them, let's not take his life. Don't shed any blood. Let's just throw him in this deep well here in the wilderness, but let's not lay a hand on him. In fact, Reuben said this because he wanted to come back and rescue Joseph and take him to be with his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they caught hold of him. They stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it, but it was still a cistern. So think about this. Now, this evil plan, we read this and you think, wow, where'd that come from? Actually, we know where it came from. Like this evil plan that the brothers just carried out on Joseph's life, it wasn't concocted in one day. Right? There's no great evil that ever takes place in a vacuum. We hear of some horrible events and school shootings and someone going into a movie theater and just shooting people up. That doesn't happen in one moment. They don't snap in one moment. What's often happened is that there's been years of things slow boiling. Right? There's been things boiling and they're not dealing with it and things are starting to boil. And then one action eventually triggers a violent reaction and great evil happens. And I think we could safely guess that this is not the first time the brothers entertained the thought of murdering Joseph. You remember, this family is already dysfunctional. There's sister wives, there's like servant maid wives, there's all kinds of competition going on in this family. In fact, here's something interesting. The location where the brothers went to go graze their animals was a location called Shechem. Do you remember where Shechem is? Shechem is the same place where the brothers murdered every person, every guy in town. They're back at it again. Except this time, it's not just personal, it's family. They're taking Joseph's life. And were it not for the grace of God, and were it not the fact that God had previously made a covenant to Jacob that one of his sons, or out of his sons, would come a great nation, and were it not for the fact that God already promised Joe in a dream that God would use him to save many nations, were it not for the fact that God was already working in Joe's life for Joe's good and for God's glory, this story would be over in that well. I mean, this dude would literally drown or die in that well. But God was at work in Joseph's life in spite of the literal mini hell that he's in. You got to picture this cistern. It says there's no water in it, but there's quicksand in there. It's dark, it's cold, it's scary. Could you imagine Joseph's reaction as his brothers take hold of him, rip off his ornate robe, and they throw him in this well? Can you imagine how much pleading and crying this guy is doing at this point? But in spite of all Joe's going to suffer, God is going to leverage this evil that he just experienced. And God's going to use this great evil, and God's going to work it out for an unbelievable amount of good. In fact, God's going to work through this evil experience that Joseph's going to go through, and God's going to bring Joseph through an experience where he's going to be in a position much greater than he ever even dreamed or imagined. And it starts in verse 25. Actually, we're not going to get to the redemption part. We're just going to talk about how things get from bad to worse. Verse 25. It says, as the brothers sat down to eat their meal. Think about that. These dudes just kind of almost passed not murdering their brother. There's no conviction. They're like, you know what? We just threw him in the well. Let's eat some lunch. They start eating. They look up and they see a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Verse 25. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh. And they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Verse 26. Judah, that's one of the sons, said to his brothers, hey, listen, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's just sell him. They've gone from not liking him to hating him to being jealous of him to trying to kill him, but then changing their mind to just burying him in a hole, and now they want to sell him. He says, what will we gain if we kill our brothers and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites, and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. Hey, thank you. Right? His brothers agreed. Verse 28. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Israelites who took him to Egypt. Verse 31. Jump down to 31. Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. Verse 32, they took the ornate robe back to their father and said, hey, listen, Dad, we found this. Examine it to see if it's your son's robe. Verse 33, Jacob recognized it and said, oh, it is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has been torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. In other words, he's grieving. Verse 36. We go back to Joseph. It says, meanwhile, the Midianites who bought Joe the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Tonight's message is about pain. It's about pain in family. You know, this would perhaps, maybe not understandable, but this would be bearable if we knew that this was some random people who caught him. But this is family. Can you imagine how traumatic this experience must have been for Joseph? By the way, this wasn't one of those times in the Bible where, Joseph is not being dragged off and Joseph says, Lord, I just give my soul to you. This is not that. In fact, later on in this story, in Genesis chapter 42:21, it says that the brothers are recounting what happened, and they said, man, when we were getting him, he was distressed. He was anguished in his soul. You know, I've never been kidnapped before. I hope I never am. But I have to imagine that's the level of panic that sets in when one is kidnapped. All of a sudden, you're being yanked away from your family. Here's what's worse. They just told his father an animal ate him. So there's no search party looking for him. Everyone thinks he's dead. This boy is, how much further from God's plan for your life can you get? This is bad. Joe isn't screaming, Lord, let thy will be done. Joe is screaming, God, get me out of here. I want out. He's begging his brothers. He's in pain. I'm sorry what I did. I ain't going to do it again. You know, I said a few weeks ago, every time I read the story of Joseph, I always cry. I tell my wife, she's like, why are you crying? And I thought about it this week, and this is going to crack you up a little, or maybe not. But it occurred to me that the reason why I always cry is because at some level, growing up, I think I felt like Joseph as a kid. I always thought my family would sell me. And, I had some weird relationships growing up with my parents. And I think, we talk about some issues in our family. We all have issues in our families. And I remember growing up and I'm one of three kids. I'm the middle kid. I need middle children here. All right, there's some pain in being a middle child sometimes, right? You're not really the all-star firstborn, nor are you the pet of the house, the thirdborn, because I had two siblings, so I was a middle child. And so I'm kind of in that weird spot where I'm like, hey, you exist, so awesome, right? And so, I oftentimes felt, and so anyway, maybe that's why. That's my own family, right? You've got your different, I always say, we each have different flavors of dysfunctional drama in our families. Some of you guys, some of your drama in your family is more bitter than others, but we all have some level of dysfunction. Now, I'm going to end the story tonight. I'm actually going to close our time together tonight. But here's the deal. I don't think it's appropriate for me to leave you guys with Joseph just being dragged off to prison. Because, we're Americans. We love a good, happy ending, right? You don't like those movies where it ends bad, except for Braveheart, which is awesome, but that's another story. So let me say this. Next week and in the coming weeks, here's what we're going to see. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to walk with Joseph through his time in slavery to some really awful events, and ultimately we're going to follow him and watch how God redeems him and lifts him high and redeems him. That's what's coming up. But for now, I need to end here. In fact, 15 years later after this event, Joseph himself is going to meet up with his brothers again. That's going to be huge. He's going to meet up with his brothers again, and Joseph is going to say these words. He's going to say to them, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. For it was to save lives that God sent me here ahead of you. It's amazing that God would leverage his pain. But we're going to end Joseph's story tonight. Right? We're walking through his life. It's going to be great. We're going to end Joseph's story tonight, and I'm going to talk about some really practical things tonight. Right? Let's talk about our families. Right? Let's bring this message home. Let's talk about our own families of origin. Now, remember what I said at the beginning. That the family experiences that you had growing up as a child and the quality of relationships you had with your parents and with your siblings will shape how you view yourself today and how you interact with adults today. It has perhaps a bigger impact than you realize. And there are three things. There are really three ways that this plays out. Or really, I'm going to give you 3 points that we can learn from Joseph's life about how to work within our own dysfunctional family. Once again, when I say dysfunction, it doesn't mean your family is as bad as can be, but it means you have your own unique flavor of dysfunctionality in your family. So let's talk about them. 3 of them, you have them in your sermon notes. First one is this, point 1. Even the strongest families, even the strongest Christian families have some level of dysfunction. dysfunction. Even the strongest Christian families have some level of dysfunction. Let me ask you this. Let me be honest, okay? Have any of you in here ever looked at other families and just thought to yourself, man, I wish my family were more like those people? Come on, be honest. Give it up, all right? Or have you looked at other families and think they should be more like us? Don't raise your hands for that. I think we sometimes do that, right? I've done it before. I've looked at other families and I've thought to myself, man, I wish I was part of their family. I don't know if there's people here, right? Now, here's what's incredible. In Joseph's day, there were probably people who looked at his family and said, I wish I was a part of that family. Could you imagine that? You know, if Joseph's family lived today and they took a Christmas photo and sent it to you, you would be crying because they look so good. When you look at Joseph's story, there are some of the siblings and wives. Scripture specifically goes out of its way to say that they were good looking, which is weird. You know, like God's like, it's all about the heart. But certain people are like, I mean, Scripture says this dude was good to look at. And this girl, Rachel, is amazing, beautiful, right? And so Joseph's family is kind of a good looking family. And they took a family portrait and they sent it to you. You would be like, Lord Jesus, make my family more like this. But what's the truth? There's some dysfunction there. Right? There's some serious issues. I should have had a picture on the screen of just a happy family to show you that sometimes those pictures that you see at Walmart, would you ever see those? Like those stock photo frames and you see the family and the couple is hugging and, you know, she's got a leg up there. You're like, oh, I wish. All right, they got some dysfunction. Aside from the fact that they're models, right? The truth is that every family has its skeletons. Every family has its skeletons. It just looks different from home to home. And so here's what I want to get at with this point. Don't be so hard on your family. Don't be so hard on your family. Man, we got our own skeletons. A lady came up to me a few Sundays ago after I'd preached, and my wife came up to me and we were hugging Nathaniel. She's like, oh, you guys must be a people of prayer. I wish I was more like you. And only if she had known that a few hours earlier, my wife had just dumped Nathaniel to me because I said something dumb and I hadn't done something I was supposed to do, and she was angry, but, you know, we just happened to be smiling at the time, right? We all got our skeletons. So don't be so hard on your family. Every family has its level of dysfunction. Point number 2. This is important. First one was important. This is important. Some of your flaws, some of the things that you struggle with today, some of your flaws and shortcomings, some of your flaws today might be rooted in a deep, lingering animosity towards certain members of your family of origin. Animosity, A-N-I-M-O-S-I-T-Y. Some of your quirks and some of your shortcomings and some of your flaws today, please listen to this, might be rooted in some lingering animosity that you still have towards your family. Some of you guys are aware of that animosity. Others aren't. You're not even aware that you're angry at your family of origin for certain things that happened way back when. And because you haven't dealt with it, you know actually what that's called? It's called a father wound. Next year's conference, we have a remix conference every year. That's actually going to be the theme of it. Actually, it's not father wounds. It's about the father's heart. But that's one of the things I want to bring a speaker to come talk about, father wounds. Father wounds is not necessarily things that your father did to you, but things that you experienced growing up with your family, emotional wounds that you suffered as a young child that affect how you view yourself as an adult today. Let me give you an exercise, and it's actually in your sheet, and I want you guys, don't answer this here. There's not enough time for you to deal with this here. You got to take this home, you got to sit on it. This exercise is actually, I got this from a book by a guy named Bob Beal. He wrote a book called Why You Do What You Do. It's a phenomenal book that really helps you kind of process a lot of why you do what you do. And so there are 3 questions I want you guys to answer when you go home tonight. I highly recommend that you spend some time tonight working through these questions because it'll be very insightful into why you are the way you are. So first question is this. Answer this question. What was your dominant childhood feeling? When you think about an emotion, what was the dominant childhood feeling you struggled with? Now, don't try to think about this as an adult or try to process how you felt as an kid, as an adult, I want you to think back to your childhood and just think about the one emotion that really captured your experience as a child. So in your sheet, I think there are a number of examples there. So perhaps the emotion that comes to mind is perhaps you felt conditionally loved, special, maybe destined, favored, perhaps abused, perhaps failure, perhaps insecure. The words are there. Just think about that. Maybe your word is in there, maybe it's not in there. What was your dominant childhood feeling? Second question, what is your current dominant adult phobia? Phobia is something that maybe sometimes an unrealistic fear. What are some unrealistic fears that haunt you, your worst nightmare? What's the one thing you dread might someday happen to you, even if it never happens? What kinds of situations make you feel uneasy? What's your dominant adult phobia? And then the third question is this, what's your greatest or your dominant emotional need today? What's your dominant emotional need? What affections do you crave the most? Is it approval? Is it authority? Here's why these questions are important for you to work through. They're important for you to work through because your dominant childhood feeling will often result in your dominant adult phobia, which will then result in your dominant emotional need. You see, the things that you experienced as a kid, the feelings you had as a kid, if it's negative, you're going to spend your entire adulthood trying to avoid that emotion, which will result in you craving a specific affection. Or if your dominant childhood feeling was positive, you're going to try to recreate it as an adult. So as a kid, if your dominant emotional need was being conditioned, your dominant childhood feeling as a child was feeling conditionally loved. In other words, with your parents, you felt like in order for them to approve of you, you had to do well in school. You had to excel in school. Like it seemed like dad and mom only celebrated whenever you excelled in sport or excelled in school. You could end up, your adult phobia then could end up being just this fear of failure. And so as an adult, you spend your whole life thinking, I can't fail because failure means I'm not being loved. And so you become perhaps a workaholic. And so it can result in your dominant emotional need being a need for affirmation. Answer those questions. And when you're done answering them, just look to see if you can connect them. And it might just be, it's an interesting exercise that you can't go wrong with. It'll be very insightful to kind of reveal a little bit of why it is you do. Remember, your childhood feeling, your dominant childhood feeling will oftentimes result in your dominant adult fear, which will oftentimes result in your dominant emotional need. It's going to be very insightful if you take care of it. So that's point number 2. Point number 3, let's finish off with this. And I said I would finish 10 minutes ago, but I'm getting there. Point number 3, you might not be able to change your feelings about your parents or your siblings, but you can change your actions towards them. Might not be able to change your feelings about your family, your siblings, but man, you can change your actions about them, your action towards them, right? I mean, let's be honest. A lot of us have suffered hurt from our parents. Our parents have suffered hurts from their parents. And there's some emotional wounds that some of us are still trying to wrestle through. And so you might not always feel like embracing or celebrating or hugging or feeling good towards your parents or siblings, but you can change the way you act towards them. It's not pretending. Sometimes emotion follows actions. Let me share with you a secret that I've learned over the years. And I've learned the secret to changing people's minds. I now have mind control powers. I have learned the secret to changing other people's attitudes and other people's minds. Here's how. The way that you change other people's attitudes and mindset is by changing your attitude and your mindset. That's how you change other people's attitudes. In fact, that's more of a trick response because in reality, you're not changing anybody else's emotions or attitude or mindset. When you change yours, what happens is that you begin to perceive them differently. And frankly, let's just be honest, it's much easier and it takes less time to change your attitude than it does to change other people, right? It takes less time. Here's what I've discovered in my life, or at least with some of my lingering animosity towards some of my family members. And here's what I found, that the more I grow and I'm mature, all right, and let me emphasize the fact that I am a growing Christian. I have not arrived. I emphasize that for all of us, the goal is to be in a growing relationship with Jesus Christ. Don't beat yourself up because you're not at some elevated Christian superiority level, right? The goal is to be one who's continually growing, because when you stop growing, you die, right? So as I deal with my issues or some of my lingering animosity, I've discovered that as I grow in my relationship with Jesus Christ, and the more I grow in my understanding of how much God loves me and how much I could do nothing to earn God's love, the more it's easy for me, the easier it's become for me to really forgive family members who I perceive have really offended me. There's some hurt that I really haven't dealt with yet. But I'm realizing that the more I kind of surrender my life to Christ and the more I embrace the fact that I could do nothing to earn God's love, the more it's easier for me to kind of let go of some of the pain and the hurt that I've suffered. And the easier it's become for me to sit with some family members and to say, hey, listen, I want to talk a little bit about some of my experiences growing up. You know, some of the things I went through. And they might not acknowledge that it happened, but it's okay because as I'm growing in my relationship with Jesus Christ, I'm learning to let it go more. So here's the fact of the matter. The households that you grew up in and the relationship dynamics you experience will shape who you are today, for better or for worse. You can't change the things that have happened in the past, but you can change how you respond to it today. And frankly, let me be honest with you, that cannot start unless you know Jesus Christ. Let me just call it what it is. It has to start with a relationship with Jesus Christ. You have to get to a point in your life, like Romans chapter 10, verse 9 says, that if you confess with your mouth that Jesus Christ is Lord and you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. And you know what? Here's the deal. You're saved once when you put your faith in Jesus Christ, but man, you got to be growing daily. You got to come at it daily. God's word says his mercies are new every morning. I should really make that my new favorite Bible verse. God's mercies are new every morning. That means if I screwed up last night, I screwed up yesterday, Monday morning I'm going to get on my knees and start again with Jesus Christ because he says come. Our families shape who we are today. But you don't have to be stuck in that. You can break out from that. You can break out from that as you work through some of these 3 points we talked about, and ultimately as you grow and surrender to Jesus Christ. Amen?